Midnight, invited as a guest, Jasmine Crockett, a sharp, calm civil rights lawyer, was ambushed live on The View by none other than Whoopi Goldberg and her co-hosts in a segment that felt less like a discussion and more like a setup. Weeks later, Crockett fired back, not with outrage, but with hard evidence. 024, overnight, the network's reputation collapsed, followed by a staggering $800 million judgment against ABC. How did one woman with no platform, no spotlight, bring an entire media empire to its knees? Stay with us. This story is worth every second of your time. The alert hit every screen in America like a missile breaking. Jasmine Crockett wins $800 million defamation case against The View. 053, in seconds, newsrooms erupted, live broadcasts were interrupted, and anchors scrambled for words. It wasn't just a lawsuit. It was a moment that broke the rhythm of the country. On CNN, the anchor's voice faltered as the headlines scrolled in red. On Fox News, commentators paused mid-debate. Social media exploded. 113, hashtags like hashtag Crockett verdict and hashtag media accountability surged to the top within minutes. In living rooms and diners, barber shops and break rooms, people leaned closer to their screens in disbelief. The View, a talk show so deeply woven into the American cultural fabric, had just been defeated in court by someone the media once mocked and dismissed. 135, a black woman, a lawyer, not a celebrity, not a media darling, but someone who had to fight for every inch of space she occupied. To the casual viewer, Jasmine Crockett had been nothing more than a guest, another voice brought in to be cornered, challenged, and chewed up for entertainment. 158, but to those who watch closely, who notice the smirks, the backhanded compliments, the orchestrated interruptions, this verdict was a long overdue reckoning. The injustice wasn't subtle. It was on national television. She had been condescended to, painted as a token, and told to her face that she wouldn't even have a voice if not for diversity initiatives. The audience had laughed. 221, the panel had smiled. The producers had nodded behind the scenes. But Jasmine hadn't flinched. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't fold. Instead, she went home, called her legal team, and began one of the most powerful legal counterstrikes in the history of television. And now, she stood victorious, calm, composed, and unapologetically right. 245, news outlets called it the trial that shook modern media. Legal analysts labeled it a new precedent. It wasn't just about the money. It was about humiliation turned into justice. About bias turned into consequence. In a media landscape where apologies are rare and accountability even rarer, Jasmine Crockett had just shattered a wall no one believed could break. 311, viewers who once accepted the game as entertainment were now seeing the rigged board behind it. The real question echoing across airwaves, in headlines, and in every stunned conversation was this: how did one woman, without fame, without favor, without fear, bring down a $100 million per year talk show and make the entire industry feel vulnerable? Jasmine Crockett didn't come from wealth or influence. 339, she grew up in South Dallas, in a neighborhood where opportunities were rare and expectations were low. Without family connections or financial support, she worked her way through law school, studying during the day, waiting tables at night. From the start of her legal career, she faced constant bias. Judges assumed she was an assistant. Clients asked if she was the intern. For 02, colleagues doubted her, not because of her skills, but because of what she looked like and where she came from. Still, she kept going. Her first big case was against a powerful real estate firm, and she won. No cameras, no headlines, just a quiet, hard-fought victory. One case turned into many. Step by step, she built a reputation as someone who didn't back down. 429, even when the odds were stacked high. So when The View tried to tear her down on national television, they didn't see the years of quiet resilience behind her calm smile. With a quiet track record of courtroom victories and a reputation built on substance, not spectacle, Jasmine Crockett finally stepped into a national spotlight. 453, unaware that this time the battle wouldn't be fought in a courtroom, but on a sound stage dressed as one. Jasmine Crockett was invited to The View as an honored guest, asked to weigh in on two weighty topics: a new federal bill addressing racial and gender equity, and the ongoing debate around systemic privilege in American institutions. 519, it was billed as a respectful conversation, a platform for informed voices across the aisle. Jasmine came prepared, like she always did. Briefing binder in hand, legal precedent highlighted, statistical data memorized. She wore a simple navy suit, no frills makeup, and the quiet confidence of someone ready to debate policy, not petty insults. Her intent was clear: to speak truthfully about law, to represent those who rarely get the microphone, and to rise above partisanship. 5:54. What she didn't know was that behind the scenes, producers had mapped out something very different. Segments were tightly scripted. Host questions were pre-written with trigger points. Off-camera instructions circled the stage like storm clouds. Jasmine wasn't walking into a dialogue. She was walking into a carefully staged takedown, dressed up as daytime television. 6:19, and every smile she was greeted with hid the same sharp edge. This was never meant to be a conversation. It was meant to be a trap. The moment Jasmine Crockett stepped onto that glossy stage, it became painfully clear: this wasn't a platform for discourse. It was a performance, and she had been cast as the foil. From the instant the lights came up and the music faded out, something about the room felt off. 6:47, the smiles were there, perfectly timed and camera-ready, but hollow. Eyes that didn't warm, expressions that seemed more rehearsed than real. Jasmine sat upright, calm, and focused, her binder of notes neatly arranged in front of her. She was ready to talk policy, prepared to speak clearly, respectfully, and directly about legal reform and social equity. 7:14, but across the table, body language told another story. Arms folded just a little too tightly. Eyes scanning her with polite tension. The tone wasn't welcoming. It was cautious, guarded, like a group ready to circle the wagons, not share the stage. Then Joy Behar leaned in just enough to command the camera's full attention and delivered the first line that shifted the tone from cold to cutting. 7:44, Joy Behar, the longest-serving co-host of The View, known for her sharp tongue and biting wit, had built a career on towing the line between humor and hostility. She smiled as she spoke, but there was no mistaking the edge in her words. "I guess Jasmine's here today because she's trendy," she said with a tone that mocked more than it questioned. The audience gave a weak, confused chuckle. 8:08, the kind of laughter that lingers too long in silence. It wasn't a question. It wasn't even a joke. It was a dismissal wrapped in fake warmth. A subtle but public way of saying Jasmine didn't belong. Jasmine didn't flinch. She held her posture, her silence more powerful than any retort. 8:32, but in that moment, before a single topic had been discussed, the stage had been set. This wasn't going to be a conversation. It was going to be a controlled takedown. If Joy Behar's remark was a jab disguised as humor, what came next was a direct hit, delivered with a smile and dressed in the language of professionalism. 8:55, Sunny Hostin, a former federal prosecutor and one of The View's most vocal commentators on race and justice, sat just a few feet from Jasmine. With her polished tone and legal background, Sunny often carried an air of authority that made her words land with extra weight. She didn't need to raise her voice. She knew how to make a statement sound like truth. 9:15, she adjusted her posture slightly, her expression unreadable, then spoke with calm, deliberate control. "Let's not pretend this is about qualifications," she said, letting each word hang in the air like a closing argument. A brief pause followed, not out of hesitation, but for effect. 9:36, she's just the result of a diversity hire, isn't she? The impact was immediate. Her voice was steady. Her delivery professional. But the accusation was anything but neutral. It wasn't a question. It was a verdict. In one breath, Sunny erased Jasmine's credentials, her hard-earned experience, and her right to be there. The room tightened. 9:59, a few awkward chuckles broke the silence, but most of the audience simply watched, quiet, uncertain, complicit. None of the co-hosts objected. No one interrupted. Jasmine sat still, her eyes fixed ahead, her body unmoved. Inside, she knew the drill. This wasn't the first time her achievements had been reduced to optics, but this time it was happening live on national television, from someone who claimed to stand for justice. 10:26, and in that moment, the weight of Sunny Hostin's words didn't just bruise. It confirmed exactly what Jasmine had suspected walking into that studio: the game had been rigged long before the cameras ever started rolling. Whoopi Goldberg, the anchor of The View, had been silent through the tension, watching, listening, arms crossed in her usual pose of quiet authority. 10:54, she had built her name on honesty, on saying the hard things no one else would, and she wasn't about to hold back now. As the oldest and most experienced voice at the table, when she leaned forward, the entire room seemed to tilt with her. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her tone was flat, slow, deliberate, the kind of calm that feels colder than anger. She looked directly at Jasmine, expression steady, and spoke clearly. 11:20, let's be real, she said. If it weren't for diversity programs, you wouldn't be sitting here right now. There was no emotion in her voice, just the weight of certainty. This seat, it didn't come from experience. It came from a checklist. She let the words sit. No one interrupted. Jasmine didn't move. 11:44, then Whoopi went on, her tone never changing. I've seen a lot of talented people get passed over, she said. People who have put in years of work and never got this kind of platform. She didn't name names. She didn't need to. You walked in with a nice resume, sure, but let's not act like that's why you're here. 12:08, and then, with a small shake of her head, she added, you were invited because you look good on paper and on camera. That's it. She leaned back slowly, folded her arms again, and didn't say another word. The message was clear. She wasn't asking for a response. She was closing the door. The insults had been delivered one after another, but Jasmine didn't rise to meet them. And that silence spoke louder than anything she could have said. 12:39, the camera slowly moved in, closing the distance between the audience and Jasmine's face. The studio was dead quiet. No one said a word. All eyes were on her, waiting, expecting her to break, to argue back, to show even the smallest crack. But Jasmine stayed still. Her face didn't twist. She didn't sigh or scoff or shake her head. She simply pressed her lips together, tight, steady. 13:02, then, after a long pause, she gave a small nod. It was barely more than a movement, but it was deliberate. She didn't nod because she agreed. She nodded because she understood exactly what was happening. She had seen it before. And instead of fighting back, she let the silence hang. 13:21, not because she didn't have a response, but because she knew there was no point arguing with people who had already decided she didn't belong. Her silence wasn't surrender. It was control. And in that moment, surrounded by cameras, lights, and judgment, Jasmine held the one thing they couldn't take from her, her composure. 13:41, the lights dimmed, the applause faded, and as the cameras cut to commercial, the real weight of what had just happened followed Jasmine off stage like a shadow that refused to leave. As Jasmine stepped behind the curtain, the noise of the studio disappeared, replaced by the low hum of equipment and distant footsteps. The hallway was cool, quiet, and empty, like the calm after a storm. 14:06, her heels clicked softly against the floor, the only sound breaking the silence. Her face remained unreadable, but her eyes had changed, no longer measured, no longer neutral. They were locked in, focused. A production assistant, young and clearly nervous, rushed to catch up with her. She didn't know what to say, but felt the need to ask something. 14:26, are you okay, she said, almost whispering. Jasmine stopped walking. She didn't look shaken. She didn't collapse. She turned to the assistant, paused for half a second, then gave a small nod and answered softly, I'm fine. Her tone wasn't warm or cold. It was calm, controlled, a voice trained to stay level when everything else wasn't. 14:50, then, with barely a breath between words, she added, now I need to call someone. Her fingers wrapped around the phone, not out of emotion, but out of clarity. This wasn't about how she felt. It was about what came next. She didn't scroll, didn't hesitate. Her thumb moved with certainty, landing on a name she had memorized, not just because of who he was, but because of what he represented. 15:18, Richard Monroe, former military prosecutor, now one of the most respected media litigators in the country. He wasn't known for making noise. He was known for making networks bleed, quietly, surgically, and with facts no PR team could spin. He had once stood alone in federal court and beat CNN in a case most attorneys wouldn't even touch. 15:39, Jasmine had followed the trial closely, not out of curiosity, but because deep down she knew one day she might need him. And now that day had come. She brought the phone to her ear, her grip steady, her voice low. There was no tremble, no anger, just a tone sharpened by everything she had just endured. "I need you," she said. 1600 hours, it's already started. On the other end, Monroe didn't ask what happened. He didn't need details. Not yet. The tone in her voice told him everything. This wasn't a woman looking to fire off tweets or make headlines. This was a woman ready to fight the only way that counted. Not in the court of opinion, but in a court of law. 1621, Jasmine didn't want revenge. She wanted accountability. And she had just called the one man who knew how to make it happen. Jasmine hadn't raised her voice in that studio. But now, weeks later, her answer came in the language the network understood best: legal action. A few weeks after the segment aired, Jasmine Crockett officially filed a civil lawsuit against The View and ABC. 1651, and it was clear from the first page that this wasn't a symbolic gesture. The suit was structured, deliberate, and firm, backed by legal arguments, timestamps, and transcripts. It accused the network of defamation, citing that specific remarks made on air had not only been false, but clearly designed to damage her reputation in front of a national audience. 1714, the legal team argued that these were not off-the-cuff opinions, but direct statements that misrepresented her qualifications, her presence, and her career. Beyond defamation, the complaint went further. It accused the producers of intentionally coordinating an on-air attack, using a scripted format meant to corner her with personal insults under the guise of conversation. 1741, Jasmine's lawyer stated that what happened was not accidental, not spontaneous. It was planned. The lawsuit described how the segment appeared designed to provoke a negative reaction, using calculated language and prearranged speaking cues between the hosts to create the appearance of consensus and authority. 1805, the most serious charge claimed that the entire segment had been orchestrated to trigger emotional distress, with the goal of turning Jasmine into a viral moment rather than a respected voice in debate. The complaint argued that the harm wasn't just reputational. It was strategic. And it was broadcast intentionally, knowing it would cause both personal and professional damage. 1829, the words may have seemed casual on the surface, but in context they were part of a clear pattern of targeted humiliation. Jasmine wasn't just taking a stand. She was drawing a legal line that said, this wasn't journalism. This was calculated harm, and someone had to answer for it. But the most damning part of Jasmine's case wasn't what had been said on camera. 1855, it was what was said when no one thought the public would ever hear it. During discovery, Jasmine's legal team combed through hundreds of internal communications, emails, scheduling notes, production outlines. But one message stopped everything. It came from the team's Slack channel, a casual message thread meant for internal coordination. 1917, the tone was informal, even flippant, but what it revealed was anything but harmless. One line, sent by a segment producer just before the taping, spelled out the intent with chilling clarity: we need drama. Let joy open. Whoopi will close hard. No discussion of topics. No mention of facts. Just a strategy. Step by step. Character by character. 1942, it wasn't about content. It was about conflict. The message made clear that Jasmine's segment wasn't designed to inform the audience or challenge ideas. It was scripted chaos, planned to escalate tension, not truth. The legal team included a screenshot of the Slack message in the lawsuit. There was no ambiguity, no way to spin it. 2004, it showed exactly how the show's producers had treated her appearance, not as a respectful invitation to speak, but as a chance to create a viral moment at her expense. In that moment, Jasmine stopped being a guest and became a target. They didn't just want conversation. They wanted a spectacle. And they chose her as the centerpiece. 2025, that one sentence became the centerpiece of the case. Not speculation, not opinion, just a quiet digital message that exposed everything behind the polished smiles and camera-ready questions. This wasn't accidental harm. It was calculated humiliation, planned in advance and delivered on cue. If the Slack message showed the plan, what came next proved the intent, and it was captured in a voice that was never meant to be heard outside the control room. 2056, among the evidence gathered by Jasmine's legal team was a short audio clip, low-quality background chatter, almost thrown away in the noise of post-cleanup. But what it captured changed everything. The voice belonged to a production assistant, recorded unintentionally as crew packed up equipment and reset the stage. At first, it sounded like nothing more than casual debriefing, loose conversation between staff after a long taping. But one line cut through the rest. "She's stronger than I thought," the voice said, followed by a pause. "Then, but I think we got to." 21:29, her. She wobbled just a little. It wasn't said with regret. It was said with satisfaction, like a challenge had been issued and met, not with facts, but with pressure. That sentence was not the voice of someone reflecting on a debate. It was the voice of someone measuring the damage. Quiet, confident, certain. 21:49, it confirmed what Jasmine had long suspected. The segment was never about hearing her point of view. It was about breaking her down piece by piece, moment by moment, until the audience saw her not as a threat, but as someone defeated. And this assistant believed they had succeeded, not completely, but enough to walk away feeling proud. 22:09, that single remark, buried in the noise, became one of the clearest signs of intent the case had. It showed the mindset behind the curtain, not curiosity, not balance, but control through humiliation. But the clearest evidence of premeditation didn't come in text or whispers. It came in full color, with studio lights on and microphones still clipped in place. 22:28, among the most critical pieces of evidence submitted was a backstage rehearsal clip, an internal recording used by producers for timing and host coordination. It wasn't meant for public release. It wasn't edited for image. It showed the hosts before the show, off-air but fully mic'd, walking through their segment like a cast preparing for a scene. 22:49, Joy Behar sat with a notepad, flipping through talking points while muttering lines under her breath. At one point she looked up and asked, "You want me to start light or just go straight in?" A producer's voice replied clearly off camera, "Start with a joke. Soft jab, just enough to get a reaction." Sunny Hostin was next. She rehearsed her line twice, shifting her posture and tone to land it without sounding too harsh. 23:15, her words were nearly identical to what she would later say live. No improvisation, just repetition. Then, Whoopi stepped in. She hadn't spoken much during rehearsal, but when she finally did, her role was clear. "So I close it?" she asked. A pause. Then someone, possibly the showrunner, answered, "Yes." Keep it grounded, calm, but final. 23:37, there was no discussion about Jasmine's actual policy views. No reference to letting the conversation flow naturally. It wasn't a conversation they were preparing for. It was a confrontation. The entire segment had been structured like a performance, and each host had been assigned a role, one to provoke, one to undermine, one to deliver the final word. Jasmine hadn't been invited for a fair exchange. 2400 hours 04, she had been walked into a script, one where she was never meant to walk out with her dignity intact. And now, that rehearsal clip was no longer just backstage prep. It was proof of intent. Taken together, the Slack message, the audio recording, and the rehearsal clip, what emerged wasn't a mistake or a misunderstanding. It was something far more deliberate. The evidence didn't suggest miscommunication. It revealed a design. 2400 hours 28, piece by piece, the puzzle came together, and the picture it painted was undeniable. This wasn't a talk show segment. It was a staged confrontation. Every detail pointed in one direction. The producers had chosen their target. The hosts had practiced their roles. The emotional cues were planned. 2400 hours 47, the rhythm was timed. And the outcome was predicted before Jasmine ever walked onto that stage. From the outside it looked like a panel discussion, but behind the curtain it operated like a script. Each word chosen not for truth, but for impact. There was no interest in hearing her perspective, no room for honest debate. 25:10, Jasmine wasn't brought in to be part of a conversation. She was brought in to be broken down on cue, on camera, and on schedule. What aired to millions was packaged as journalism, but underneath it was something much darker, a carefully engineered takedown disguised as television. 25:29, once the curtain had been pulled back on the truth, there was only one place left to confront it, under oath, in open court, where the cameras couldn't be edited and the silence had to answer for itself. By the time the courthouse doors opened, the sidewalks were already full. News vans lined the street. 25:48, journalists clustered near the steps with microphones in hand, speaking into cameras with voices tight from the early morning chill. Every network was there, national anchors, legal analysts, columnists. Inside the building, the hallway outside the courtroom felt more like a press pit than a place of law. The wooden benches were packed. Reporters scribbled in notepads. Courtroom sketch artists leaned in, trying to capture every detail. And beyond the reporters and the flashing cameras, there was the crowd. 26:14, members of the public who had followed Jasmine's story from day one, waiting for a seat. Many of them were turned away once the gallery reached capacity. Then Jasmine Crockett arrived. She stepped through the security gate without a word, her face calm, her stride measured. 26:33, she wore a tailored black suit, crisp and simple, without jewelry or bright color. No makeup, no statement, no dramatics. Her hair pulled back, her hands empty except for a thin case file. There were no smiles, no greetings, only stillness, only focus. She moved through the crowded hallway without flinching, as if she belonged there. 26:57, not as a victim, not as a celebrity, but as a woman who had earned her right to be heard. No spin, no performance, just truth walking on steady feet. Not long after, the defendants entered, less like the dominant personalities the public was used to, and more like people hoping not to be seen. Whoopi Goldberg came first, her face mostly hidden behind large dark sunglasses. 27:20, she kept her head down and moved quickly, flanked by legal counsel, saying nothing. Joy Behar followed, her posture rigid, jaw clenched, holding a phone in one hand she never looked at. Sunny Hostin was the last to enter. Normally poised and unshakable, she now looked tight in the shoulders, gripping a folder with both hands like a shield. None of them met anyone's eyes. 27:43, they avoided the cameras. There were no waves to the press, no quick jokes, no friendly smiles. The mood was heavy, controlled, fearful. The contrast was sharp even before the judge took the bench. Jasmine stood alone, composed, carrying nothing but her case. 28:04, they entered together, but without unity, weighed down by silence and the gravity of what they were about to face. In the studio, they had held the power. Here they were just defendants, stripped of applause, cut off from editing rooms, and finally forced to sit in a space where truth wasn't scripted, where everything they'd said and everything they'd hidden was about to be brought into the light. 28:23, but everything that had been said, implied, and denied finally came to a head when Jasmine's legal team pressed play and let the evidence speak for itself. The lights inside the courtroom dimmed just slightly as the screen came to life, glowing quietly at the front of the room. The jury leaned forward. Reporters stopped taking notes. 28:42, even the judge sat straighter in his chair. The video began without any music. No editing, just raw footage synced with internal production notes. The audio crackled faintly. A few voices in the background. Nothing dramatic yet. Then the words appeared on the screen in large white text, pulled directly from the producer's planning document. 29:03, she's the target today. We need viral. There was no commentary, no narration, just those 9 words hanging in the silence like a confession. The courtroom froze. No movement, no reaction, just stillness. Jasmine didn't flinch. She stood beside her attorney, eyes forward, unmoving. 29:26, the hosts at the defense table sat pale and silent, their expressions tightened as if physically bracing for impact. A long second passed, then another, before one small human moment broke through the quiet. A male juror, likely in his late 60s, blinked slowly and leaned forward in his seat, his lips pressed together, his jaw clenched. And then his eyes, already glossy, filled fully with tears. 29:47, he reached once to wipe them with the edge of his sleeve. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't for show. It was the quiet, involuntary response of a man who had just witnessed something deeply wrong. Not a debate, not even an insult, but a strategy to publicly dismantle a person for the sake of internet clicks. 30:12, that realization hit harder than any argument ever could. And for the first time in the trial, the room didn't feel like a courtroom. It felt like a reckoning. The judge adjusted his glasses, looked down at the documents before him, then slowly lifted his head. The entire courtroom leaned in. No movement. No whisper, not even the shuffle of a foot. 30:30, Jasmine stood quietly next to her legal team, eyes steady, hands clasped in front of her. Across the aisle, the defendants sat frozen, their attorneys tense, waiting. The judge cleared his throat once, then spoke with firm, controlled authority. 30:49, in the matter of Jasmine Crockett versus the American Broadcasting Company and The View, this court finds the defendants legally liable for defamation, targeted reputational harm, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The words rang out, slow and final. Then came the sentence that hit like a hammer: damages are awarded to the plaintiff in the amount of $800 million. Gasps broke out across the gallery, sharp, uncontrolled. 31:14, a reporter in the press box dropped her notepad. One juror shook his head in disbelief. At the defense table, the shift was immediate. Whoopi Goldberg sat utterly still, her jaw locked, lips pressed together. Joy Behar lowered her gaze, staring blankly at the floor. Sunny Hostin leaned back in her chair, her fingers gripping the sides as if trying to ground herself. No one spoke. 31:40, no one blinked. For a brief moment, it felt like time had stopped. Jasmine didn't raise a fist. She didn't cry. She just let out a long, quiet breath, a release not of celebration, but of justice finally landing after being held back for too long. It wasn't about money. It was about truth. 32:04, and now that truth had a number large enough to shake an entire industry. The verdict didn't just end a trial. It triggered a landslide. Within hours, the weight of accountability rippled far beyond the courtroom walls, and the empire that once mocked Jasmine Crockett began to collapse under the truth it tried to bury. The ruling had barely made its way across. 32:24, news tickers when the first cracks in ABC's foundation began to show. By noon the next day, nearly 70% of the network's national advertising contracts had been frozen or pulled entirely. Major sponsors, household names, wanted distance, not explanations. Executives scrambled to issue statements, but the silence from advertisers said more than any PR spin could. 32:48, inside ABC headquarters, emergency meetings ran around the clock. Phones rang non-stop. What had once been a confident media machine now moved like a ship taking on water. One insider, speaking to the press under condition of anonymity, summed it up with brutal clarity: "We underestimated the wrong woman." It wasn't said in anger. It was said in awe and fear. 33:13, the impact was swift. In public, The View, long considered untouchable in the world of daytime television, was placed on indefinite suspension less than 48 hours after the verdict. The phrase used in the press release was sterile, corporate, but everyone knew what it meant. Production stopped. Cameras were packed away. Studio lights stayed off. 33:39, the audience who once laughed on cue had vanished, replaced by headlines that no one at ABC could control. Internally, morale crumbled. Staffers were told to stay home. Reruns were pulled. Affiliate networks demanded answers. What had started as a single lawsuit had now triggered a network-wide identity crisis, and no one knew what might be left standing. Behind closed doors, the fallout was even more dramatic. 34:04, one host, her name withheld from the public for privacy, formally submitted her resignation the morning after the ruling. No farewell post, no interview, just a legal withdrawal and immediate departure from all on-air duties. Another, reportedly overwhelmed by the pace and weight of the collapse, was quietly admitted to a private care facility for what sources later described as acute psychological distress. 34:33, ABC issued a one-line statement asking for privacy, but the damage was done. The public saw what had once been the face of media power now shaken, cornered, and visibly unraveling. For years, The View had been seen as bulletproof, anchored by celebrity, tradition, and the illusion of credibility. But the lawsuit shattered that illusion in a matter of days. 34:59, and now the network behind it all was staring at one of the largest financial and reputational disasters in its history. Viewers who had once tuned in every morning now watched news clips of producers being escorted out. Internal investigations were launched. Shareholders demanded answers. And across social media, where the viral plan had originally been designed to play out, the message had been flipped completely. 35:23, hashtags like hashtag We Stand With Jasmine and hashtag Media on Trial dominated every platform. Memes were replaced by outrage. Clips of the courtroom verdict were replayed millions of times within days. Each one a reminder that power doesn't protect you from accountability. It only delays it. ABC, a network that had built its brand on public trust, now faced a public reckoning of its own. 35:42, executives were grilled in boardrooms. Emails leaked. Sponsors walked. Public relations firms were brought in, but none could undo what had already been seen, heard, and ruled on in court. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. A show designed to interrogate others had now become the subject of the nation's most relentless scrutiny. And at the center of it all stood Jasmine Crockett. 36:10, not loud, not bitter, not boastful, just resolute. The woman they once laughed over on a morning segment had now delivered a blow so precise, so undeniable, that the entire system surrounding her had started to break. What made it more devastating wasn't just the money or the headlines. It was the clarity. The evidence had been overwhelming. 36:34, the intent had been proven. And the consequences were no longer theoretical. They were real, measurable, and unavoidable. The View had tried to turn her into a viral moment. Instead, she became a movement. And in doing so, she didn't just win a case. She rewrote the boundaries of media accountability in modern America. The headlines screamed. The network spun. And the internet moved like wildfire. 36:57, but Jasmine didn't. She didn't chase the cameras. She didn't bask in the victory. She walked away from the noise and let the truth echo without her having to say a word. There was no press conference, no podium, no victory walk. While every media outlet scrambled for an exclusive, while every camera crew set up outside the courthouse hoping she'd stop and speak, Jasmine Crockett simply stepped into a waiting car and disappeared. 37:22, she didn't live stream a reaction. She didn't give a speech. She didn't need to. Hours later, when the world was refreshing headlines and waiting for a soundbite, Jasmine posted just one sentence to her Twitter account. No hashtags, no emojis, no image, just 12 words on a plain background. Justice doesn't need noise. It only needs persistence. It wasn't a quote for applause. 37:48, it was a truth carved from experience. Simple, sharp, and earned. That was all. No follow-up, no comment thread, no interview circuit. While others would have paraded through morning shows and primetime slots, Jasmine chose silence. Because she didn't win for show. She didn't win to be celebrated. She won because someone had to remind the system that dignity is not a weakness. 38:14, that silence, when chosen, is more powerful than 1,000 microphones shoved in your face. And that justice, real justice, isn't measured in retweets. It's measured in what it changes. And in the days that followed, it changed more than anyone expected. What Jasmine hadn't anticipated was the wave that came next. Not from the media, but from men, not influencers or celebrities or activists. 38:39, but men who had grown up watching talk shows casually chip away at truth and respect. Men who had seen public discourse twist into spectacle and who'd long ago stopped speaking up because they thought no one would hear them. Men who were used to being told to be quiet, to accept the way things were. 38:58, and now, for the first time in years, they were writing letters, thousands of them. Handwritten, typed, emailed, faxed, every format, every voice from every corner of the country. Some were only a sentence long, others were several pages. They came from veterans, from retired truck drivers, from teachers, steel workers, farmers, and grandfathers. Some were shaky with age, signed in careful cursive. 39:22, others were typed.